가상나서 가리고라고 주시겠습니까? 아니 재미있게
So yesterday what we looked at was what it means to be an infallible being.
아니 재미있게 주시겠죠? 아니 주로 보면 재미있게 보세요. 아니 간지도 재미있게 보세요. was라는 이 지경이 뉴주 당시 제법 보이는 게 근데 내기 가사디에 루어면 되지. 근데 코랑 간지 충분히 나오니까 근데 코랑 위기 이게 뭐 많이 아바람 중에 있겠지. 또 당자
So the non-Buddhist presentation of what it means or what it entails to be an infallible being was that an infallible being is one that has created both the external and internal world, so sentient beings and the world, and also knows sentient beings and the world, but the way in which it came to know them or the way in which it came to exist itself is not reliant on causes and is permanent and self-arisen or spontaneously arisen.
아니 배출 전에 아니 주소미 당제 아니 감지기 제하고 원주기 아니 시가 세만디 세만케는 받아 아바케는 인도도 우세 유지 아니 감지기 제하고 원주기 있어가 되나 한 아바 있어가 인도도 우스 소 가상
And so the first contradictions are that if it knows everything, then it can't be permanent. So knowing everything and permanence, that was the first contradiction. And the second contradiction is if it creates everything, then it can't be permanent. So those were the two main contradictions that we saw yesterday.
아이케랑이 유주소디 아빠이 말되나 아빠 세만 아빠 개념 받되나 아니 유탕지 아니 케마시아가 있는 이두 담아 그런 또 유주직이 아빠가 유주직이 도와 아무상이 유주만 소디 이들이 이 원주기 시바니가 아빠 케님이스 나와니스 이래야 유주탐지 최고 이거는 유주간의 감도
So now today we move on with the text. So as the discussion progresses, the opponent over here, they say, well, all the reasoning that you have given works because I accept that there are certain contradictions with saying that Ishvara can be permanent. I don't have a problem with that anymore. But since your critique is primarily directed at the idea that Ishvara is permanent, I now let go of the position that Ishvara could be permanent. So I now imagine another alternative where Ishvara is impermanent, but the fact that he is still the creator of everything, that doesn't have to necessarily also be disproved by what you've done. So Ishvara remains the creator of everything. But now, because there is a contradiction with the permanence aspect, I let that go. What's the problem if the creator of all happens to be impermanent? Then, so it says over here, one may say in the text, it says, even if Ishvara is impermanent, there is nothing to disprove that he is a spontaneously arisen infallible being. And the reply to that over here, that Acharya Dharmakirti gives is, if you say that, then the root verse says, even if impermanent, there is no valid cognition. So over here, if you say that Ishvara is the creator of everything and is impermanent, then in the commentary it says, even if Ishvara were permanent, there is no valid cognition to establish it as such, as in as the creator of all the worlds and beings. So even if you now change your position and say it's impermanent, there is still a problem because there is no reason or valid reason or cognition that can establish Ishvara to be the creator of everything. So here, where it says there is no valid cognition, it's saying that there is no valid proof. Here there's no valid cognition because there's no valid reason that you can give to sustain or support why Ishvara is the creator of everything while being simultaneously impermanent. So there's no valid cognition because there is no correct reason that you can supply or give to explain why he is the creator of everything. So in response to Acharya Dharmakirti saying you don't have any reasons to support that Ishvara is the creator of everything, they reply by saying no, that's not true. So you see where it says they say, you'll see in the text that suggests that it's the opinion, that it's the opponent's view, right? And then you'll also see the inverted comma suggesting that it's their position. Yeah? Okay? Oh, sorry, yeah. And so it says, they say, so they're giving now their reasons for why they say that there is evidence to support that Ishvara is the creator of all while being impermanent. And the reasons they give are, in the root verse it says, action following rest, having particular shapes and serving a purpose, and so on. So this is what they give as reasons to support that Ishvara is the creator of everything. So in this root verse, there's 3 reasons that they're giving. If you look at the commentary, it says, if you say, because the abodes and beings of the world, so abodes refers to the external world where we reside, and beings are the people that inhabit it, right? So the world and its inhabitants of this world act intermittently, that's the first reason, have particular shapes, that's the second reason, and the third is serve specific purposes, they must be preceded by the mind of a creator. And such a creator is Ishvara. So this is the opponent's position that they present. There's 3 reasons that they've given, so if you have to, you can extrapolate the syllogism from it, and the subject is the abodes and beings of the world, that's the first thing. The predicate is they must be preceded by the mind of a creator. So you have the abodes and beings of the world must be preceded by the mind of a creator. And then there's 3 different reasons. So with the same subject and the same predicate, there's 3 different reasons that have been given. One is that they act intermittently. So action following rest means that the actions happen in different moments. It stays for a bit and then it acts, it stays for a bit and then it does. Yeah? So there's an intermittency in the actions that happen. That's the first one. The second one is because they have particular shapes. So the second reason is that the world and the beings have particular shapes. That's why they must be preceded by the mind of a creator. And the third one is that they do things. So they have a purpose. They fulfill a certain purpose. They are functional. And because they are functional, they must be preceded by the mind of a creator. So there's three reasons that have been given in this verse by the opponents to establish or prove why the world must be preceded by the mind of a creator. So in the first reason, which is action following rest, or rest could also be maybe pause, just if you want to put as a note, right? There's like the example that they give, the concordant example. You remember the correct concordant examples in Tariq, right? The correct concordant example that they're giving here is, for example, when there is an axe that's cutting down a tree, the axe doesn't have the ability to act on the tree by itself. It requires someone that is wielding the axe. And the way in which the axe then cuts down the tree, or there's the tree that gets felled, is by action, which is then followed by a pause, which is then followed by another action, which is then followed by another pause. And the fact that the axe requires this kind of repeated movement or action for it to actually fell down a tree or cut down a tree suggests that the axe has someone as an agent behind it that is acting, and the manner of acting the fact that an agent is there can be inferred by the sequentiality of the actions, where there is an action followed by rest or a pause, and then another action and another pause. Similarly, since with the axe it requires someone to wield it or someone to be behind it, make it happen, or a doer, similarly, since the world that we live in also acts sequentially or intermittently, it's not all simultaneous, but it happens in gaps, with gaps. In the same way, even the world, since it has this intermittent action or sequential action, it too must have something that kind of directs it, or that is the doer behind it. And so that's how they use this as a reason to say there must be a creator behind it. The second reason, where they give having particular shapes as the reason to prove that it must be preceded by the mind of a creator, the example that they give over there in the text is a pot. But for example, if you use the cup has a distinct shape, with a specific color. And the fact that it is distinct and it has a particular unique shape and unique features is because someone made it like that. There was a creator. It had to be created with that unique, distinct, specific shape that it has. Similarly, since the world that we see, which is the external world, and when we look at sentient beings, they all have their own unique, specific unique and individual particular shapes, the same way that a cup, to be able to have that particular shape, needed to be created by somebody. The fact that the external world and sentient beings have these unique traits or unique shapes suggests that they too would have to be created by someone. So that's the example that they use for the second reason. And then for the third one, which is serving a purpose, the example that they give is the example that you can use for the third one is, for example, the mic. And the fact that there is a mic that performs this function where if I speak into the mic, sound gets amplified and then it comes out through speakers and you can all hear it louder than what it actually is. The fact that the mic can perform such a function is because there is someone who has created it with the specific intention of it being able to perform that function. So it has been endowed with that ability by the creator of the mic. Had no one created a mic, the ability for that object to perform a given function would not be there. So the fact that it performs a specific function or it has a specific purpose suggests that someone has endowed it with that quality. It has to be preceded by a creator. Similarly, since the world that we live in and sentient beings all have their own individual functions that all serve their own different purposes, those purposes that they serve also must be endowed, or they have to come about because someone has given that them to them or created the thing with that function. For instance, a cause producing an effect, a condition that supports it, and so on. So that's the example that they use for the third one, for the third reason. So these three reasons, these syllogisms, you have to kind of keep them in mind. You have to have them, I guess, memorized, right? And the syllogisms are: take the abodes and beings of the world, that's your subject. It follows they're preceded by a creator, that's your predicate. Because they, and then you have three reasons: because they act intermittently, because they have a particular shape, or because they serve specific purposes, or they perform specific functions. Yeah? So these three reasons, you have to kind of have them memorized, and you have to understand that this is the reason that is being given to support the idea that they have to be preceded by a creator. So to this reason that they have given, Acharya Dharmakirti here refutes it in three ways. So he presents his refutation of these reasons in three ways. The first refutation he does is by analyzing the predicate of the syllogism. Yeah? And so the predicate of the syllogism, he kind of critiques their reason by analyzing the predicate of the syllogism by saying there's something wrong with how you're stating the predicate. That's the first refutation. Then the second refutation is by showing the faults with the pervasion of the first reason. So there's the first reason that is given, which is because it acts intermittently. Looking at that reason, Acharya Dharmakirti says there's no pervasion. So the forward pervasion in the reason that you're giving is not there. And so by analyzing the forward pervasion, because if it's a correct sign, it has to have a pervasion. It has to have the three modes. It has to have the pervasion, the forward pervasion. So by testing and analyzing the forward pervasion of the first reason that they give, Acharya Dharmakirti says that doesn't work. And then looking at the second reason that they give, Acharya Dharmakirti also looks at the meaning of the second reason and analyzes the reason itself and says, what do you mean when you say it has particular shapes? So by analyzing their position in these three ways, Acharya Dharmakirti says these signs don't prove that there is a creator. So you have this in the text, it says refuting this has three sections. Refutation by analyzing the predicate of the probandum. So we're doing this first. And so, you know, when we say predicate of the probandum, it just means predicate of the thesis. Yeah? Okay? So the refutation is just one line, which is either it is accepted or there is no example. So it says, if this is what you mean by the probandum, we accept it. If what you're saying is not this, then you will not be able to have an example to support your position. So that's the first refutation, just with this one line.
So that Dujiche Kaji Dujiche Masong Nuju churches. Cheba Bongo to Song days. Say Cheba Bongo to Song days, say Karangi, Chitangi Cheba Bongo to songs, Laveda. And Cheba Bongo to songs. Tesamshi, Karangi, want to song to give you best. Cheba goes Dujiche, Cheba Bongo to Song days, say Kandadi Carriers. Cheba Bongo lady, Cheba body. 아니 제법을 지당이 제법고 양 제법으로 운도 송어 지당이 되지는 기유나 이 계란 나무 상계보다 두고 말에 이 계획이 이 되버디 나는 두두버렸어 니주 탐제라 지당 제법고 여봐 제법고 여봐 좀 맛에 제법으로 지 여봐 나무 상계를 기획이 이 계란 나가 두고에 계획이 되버디 나는 두두버렸어.
So the way they analyze the predicate of the probandum is like this. They ask the opponent by saying, when you say it is preceded by a creator, that's the predicate, right? If they say, do you mean it is preceded by a creator in general? Do you mean it is preceded by the mind of a creator in general? If what you mean by preceded by a creator is merely that the things have to be preceded by a creator or by the mind of a creator in general, you don't need to give this reason, because I, as a Buddhist, we Buddhists already accept this. We accept that the external world and the beings that abide in it, so beings and abodes, are preceded by a creator, and we also accept that they're preceded by the mind of a creator. If this is your intention of what you're trying to prove, you don't need to prove it to us because it is already established for us. That's what the first one says, which is that it is already accepted by us. You don't need to further establish this. So that's the first part. That this position is already accepted by us.
So that number sign gave number sign gave the number la. Among new Tamche La Chebopi. Chebopo Carrera Slavina, Chebopo Luci, Ludi Carrera Lana, Nation. So that Simjin Nambi, the Zamuli Nuji long journey, Simjin Nambi, Rangi, and Simjun Sembe Wangi, less out of the Wangi, and usually Midawa, Jew Midawa, Zamboli Gina, the Hasusun, Niju Pusun for the Masos, Cabaret, Tamjela, Simjin Rangi, Chebopo, late joy. The Niju Tamji, Chebopo to Songa, China, Chebopo late to Songa. The delay, Chebopo Lodi, Ganga Gay, Chebopo's day membership. Long shooting seems to suit leg one to be your Chebopo Lodi, Mazur to 2 years.
So according to the Buddhist system, when they say that there is a creator for the external world and for sentient beings, and there is a mind of a creator, what they mean when they say that there is a mind of a creator is they're talking about karma. So the mental factor of, how do you translate it? What's the mental factor that's inclusive with karma? Intention, yeah. That mental factor of intention, that's what the Buddhists say is the mind of the creator that precedes it. So the fact that there are differences, that there are unique features within this planet, and then within that in a certain country which has either is very rich or is poor, with all of its details and all of its differences, is preceded by the actions that have been performed by the individual that experiences the world that we live in. So the world that we experience and the person that experiences it, with all of its detail and with all of its differences, is preceded by the actions that each individual person has done. So when we say it is preceded by a creator or the mind of a creator, according to the Buddhist tenet, that creator and that mind is not some external entity that is kind of the driving force or determining how things play out, but it's each individual person that is experiencing worlds and things and situations in different ways individually, with each one's separate kind of experience, and each one of these experiences, whether it's of the external world or of the internal world, is determined by their own preceding actions. So that mental action over here is karma, and that karma is the mind that is preceding everything that exists. So that, the Buddhists say, if you're just talking about there being a mind of a creator in general, we've already understood that to be the individual mental actions or karma that people do. So you don't need to prove that to us. We already accept that it is preceded by that.
제법 물론 소리 실수라기 제법 물론 직당이 제법 물론 지금 이미 제법 물론 그런 메시지 이해했다 하가지 내가 딱서로 그런 람중 기로 되지 메시지 제법 보지 이해했어 그래도 보다기나 아니 인지들을 투비한다 믿었어 투비면은 아니 따디 제심 두고 말했어 그래서 내가 빼주고.
Now the second one is, if when you say it is preceded by a creator or by the mind of a creator, you're not saying the mind of a creator in general, but you are specifying or qualifying this mind as something. You're giving it some sort of attribute or some quality. And let's say you give it the quality of permanence, or you give it the quality of being spontaneous, effortlessly arisen by its own power. If that's the kind of mind that you're saying is the mind that is preceding everything, then you will not have a correct concordant example to give. And without a concordant example on which you can prove the pervasion, you will not be able to prove the pervasion of your reason. So the forward pervasion will not have an example for you to understand the pervasion, and therefore your reason will not pan out, because you don't have an example to establish it when you qualify the mind of a creator as being permanent or self-arisen or something like that.
데버트로 빼마투 세 뉴지디 먼저 다른 카드가 먼저 가리 장요래 제부지 따스코니 유캐벌 버드나 따야 말해 따야 내가 되제라라 주지 매일 도와요 때는 매일 두두고 지당이 매일 두두고 캐나기 되다라 때는 내 두리에기 내디 맥치상을 계정 많이 같이 내기 제라 빼는 찐딩이 매여 그게 있어봐이나 아니 따라 도와줘야지 그래기 두주셔야 유치상 뭐 이거지 유캐하고 유체하고 마치 이제 찐딩이 매여 그게나 아니 되냐라 주제 찐딩이 매여데 도와줘야지나 빼라고 도와줘나 찐딩이 매여데 빼주고 준비 제작 준비주고 이 준비라는 거 그래서 제부지 따스코니 유캐버드나 아니 된제디 따야다 말이스. 제부 따라더니 유고에 대다야다 말이스. 아주 따리는 장요와 어디수.
So if you want to understand how this connects in Tariq and where you've done this in Tariq, you know when we did correct effect causes? There are correct effect causes where a general cause, a general effect can prove a general cause. But you can't have a general effect that proves a specific cause. For instance, on a smoky hill, there is fire because there is smoke. Through the existence of smoke, you can prove that in general there's fire, But if you want to prove that there is a specific kind of fire, for instance, fire that is coming from sandalwood or something like that, you can prove that if there is smoke, there is fire. But if you take fire and then you're trying to prove a specific kind of fire by the existence of smoke, you won't find the correct concordant example. You won't find an example to prove this pervasion. That's why in Tariq we say, with a general effect, you can prove that there is a general cause. But if you're trying to go into the detail of that cause and prove a specific cause, you won't be able to, because you don't find an example. Without that example, you can't prove the forward pervasion. So in Tariq, when we've done correct effect signs, we see how smoke can prove fire, but smoke cannot prove that there is sandalwood fire or fire from leaves or grass or something like that, right? So this is how, in the same case over here, you can prove that generally there is a cause, but if you try and give it a lot of detail, that you can't prove because you don't find an example, and without an example, there's no pervasion that can be established. So like it says over here, if what you mean by saying that it acts intermittently or it has a particular shape, with these three reasons, if you're trying to show that it has the mind of a creator or there's a mind that precedes it, that's okay. Because you're proving through a general effect, you're proving a general cause. We don't have any objection with that, that much we accept. But if you then try and get into the detail and therefore not a general cause but get into more specifics about that cause by saying it is a permanent mind or it is the mind of Ishvara that precedes it, then you've gone from general cause into a specific cause, and like you will not be able to prove it in a correct effect sign, here too you will not be able to prove the pervasion. So that's what it says when it says there is no example.
I am getting the Kantamre, Yana Tesum songs. I cannot get up with the Vadilla, Tumbi Mara on the Masi, Tinsi Devara cannot partly Tangway, they cannot Tesum Sagaris. Hari Tesum Sagarana, one two Koran churches, one two Koran churches, one two churches. Kula Chababu Loman Fantas, Duty Nella Jupi Chilana, and cannot go your dad, cannot Tesum Sagaris.
Or then the next one, it says, or it leads to doubt. So now we moved on to the second, the refutation by showing faults with the pervasion of the first reason. So after having looked at the predicate of the first reason, or of all of them actually, then when you look at the pervasion of the first reason, Acharya Dharmakirti says, even your first reason won't work because it will lead to doubt. The reason it will lead to doubt is because now if I switch the subject, if you say there's pervasion, and the pervasion is if something acts intermittently, it's preceded by the mind of a creator. If you say that, then I'll change the subject of your syllogism and I'll say take Ishvara itself. Take Ishvara, it follows is preceded by the mind of a creator because he acts intermittently. And if you say acting intermittently means it has to be preceded by the mind of a creator, then Ishvara itself will have to be preceded by the mind of a creator. And so your reasoning itself will lead to doubt for you, because if I change the subject and put Ishvara, you yourself will not have a way to answer it, and so it will lead to doubt. So that's the second part where it says, or it leads to doubt. So now take the reason that they're giving, which is that Acharya Dharmakirti is giving to them, which is take Ishvara. So it says here, take Ishvara. It follows it is preceded by the mind of a creator because it acts intermittently. Once this reason has been given to them, to prove that it is a correct reason according to how they're thinking about it, you have to first prove the property of the subject. And to prove the property of the subject, you have to prove that Ishvara acts intermittently. But that's something that you can prove by noticing that the world, things arise sequentially. Things don't arise simultaneously. So if things arise sequentially and they've been created by Ishvara, the production that Ishvara is doing is not simultaneous because the effects that arise from Ishvara are not simultaneous, they arise in sequence. If they arise in sequence, from that you can come to the conclusion that the way in which Ishvara is producing the world is also sequential, and therefore Ishvara acts intermittently. So they will not be able to say the reason is not established, because you can establish the reason by showing that the effects are sequential. Yeah? And the pervasion is accepted by them. So this is a consequence, because then the pervasion will be accepted by them. They themselves have said, if things act intermittently, they have to be preceded by the mind of a creator. So they will not be able to say no pervasion to it either. At which point, if they have to accept the reason and they have to accept the pervasion, they'll have to accept the thesis, which means that they'll have to accept that Ishvara itself is preceded himself by the mind of a creator. At which point then, their position of Ishvara being the creator of everything gets affected, because take Ishvara, it follows he's not the creator of everything because Ishvara himself is created by something else. And so the idea that Ishvara is the creator of everything becomes untenable like this. And so then if you say, well then, no, the creator of Ishvara is the creator of everything, then with the same, so now you switch your subject and the creator of Ishvara becomes a subject, and they have to give a reason to support that, and that whatever reason they gave, you do the same kind of analysis, and that also will not hold. And therefore then they'll start to wonder whether this is a valid reason to prove that there is a creator or not. So this is the explanation of this 11a, which says, or it leads to doubt. So this is what, this is the analysis, or this is the kind of critique that Acharya Dharmakirti presents to the first reason, which is either it is accepted or there is no example, or it leads to doubt. So these are those two lines. So that's the critique of the first reason. Now there's the second reason, which is they have particular shapes. Yeah? And so with the second reason that they provide, Acharya Dharmakirti asks, he says, what do you mean by having particular shapes? When you say they have particular or unique shapes, this particular or unique that you're adding to having a shape, what do you mean? Do you mean it's particular or unique because it is a shape that has been created by somebody? Is that the uniqueness or the particularity of this shape? Or when you say particular shape, do you just mean that each thing has its own individual shape that distinguishes it from something else? So he asks two questions. He says, do you mean particular? Are you suggesting that particular means that it is unique and different from others? Or is it particular because it is a shape that has been created by somebody? Which one of the two is it? So if it were the first, like it says in the comment in the text, if it were the first means, if by having particular shapes you mean shapes they are particular or unique because they were made by the effort or the actions of some person, so then their reason will become take the external and internal world, or take abodes in beings, it follows they're preceded by the mind of a creator because they have a particular shape. If the meaning of particular here is that it is preceded by the actions of somebody, or it is a shape that was made by some person, then that will become your reason. If that becomes your reason, because by particular that's what you imply, then there's an analysis. The first reason is going to come now, which is when they're thinking of particular shapes as particular being made by somebody. That's the meaning of particular. So then, even though they're not saying it, what they're actually thinking, right, their reason becomes, the syllogism will become, take the abode and beings, take abodes and beings. It follows they're preceded by the mind of Ishvara. That's what they're thinking. Because they have shapes that were preceded by the actions of somebody. Or because they have shapes made by someone. Even though they might not be saying it, if by particular shapes that's what they refer to, this becomes the syllogism. So, where Acharya Dharmakirti objects to this reason is by saying, if this is what you mean, there's no property of the subject. There's no property of the subject because if your reason is it has a shape that is made by someone, then this will not work as a correct reason. There'll be no property of the subject. I do accept that if the reason were a particular shape made by somebody, then you can infer that there is a particular person that made it. So I do accept that if a shape, by particular shape you mean a shape that is made by somebody, were the reason, then through this reason you can infer that there has to be someone who made it. For example, the cup over here, since the cup has a particular shape, and by particular here, it is a shape that you can prove is made by someone. If you can prove that it has a shape that has been made by somebody, then through that shape, you can infer that there was a specific individual that made it. I don't have a problem with that. But what I do have a problem with is the world and beings having a particular shape, which means a shape made by somebody, that itself is not valid. Does that make sense? So the refutation is over here. It says, things such as shapes that are established in a manner concomitant with the actions of a person, any inference that arises from that will be correct. But it's not correct in this case because you can't prove that it has a shape made by somebody. So take the external world. It follows it is preceded by the mind of Ishvara because it has a shape made by somebody. If this reason were correct, if the property of the subject was there, then I accept that it can prove that it was preceded by the mind of Ishvara. But the property of the subject itself is not there, so inference cannot arise from such a reason. That's what the root verse says.
di kab gi ib di 간지 지열이라나 기부 소리 저수조비 입이 개발 어디 기부 소리 저수조비 인지민지 티 내고 막 기부 소리 저수조비 입이 개발 그래서 기부 소리 저수조비 입이 개발이 이유나 아니 콜라 쳐보고 아니 기부 소리 요구를 해서 뭐 그래 아 지금 뉴지디 지금 뉴지를 입이 개발해야 되면 대양 입이 기부 소리 저수조비 입이 개발해 아버지 뭐이나 아니 다 죽이면 다 죽이면 걔네 지금 뉴지 뭐든지 기부 소리 저수조비 입이 개발해나 아니 그걸 쳐보고 기부들이 지금 그거를 로고 그래서나 알아보고 있어. 그냥 얘네들 기부 소리 저수조비 입이 개발해서 다 죽이면 어떻게 아까
So just so you make sense of this, huh? When you say particular shape, we've analyzed it in two ways. Do you mean particular as in shape that was preceded by the actions of someone? Like so it says in the text, shape that requires the actions of someone who made it. If that's what particular shape means, right? Then when you look at this cup, because this cup has a particular shape, which means a shape that requires the actions of someone who made it. So you have to add this whole thing, because this is what the meaning of particular is, right? This is the first option. If particular shape means shape that was preceded, that requires the actions of someone who made it, then if you can prove that this cup has a particular shape, you can prove that there is someone who made it. Because it has a shape that requires the actions of someone who made it, right? Okay? So the Buddhists are saying, if you can prove that it has a particular shape, i.e., it has a shape that requires the actions of someone who made it, then I accept that it has to have someone who made it. There's no problem with that. But when you're saying the external world and sentient beings have a particular shape, and that particular shape you mean is a shape that requires the actions of someone who made it, that reason is not verifiable on the external world and on sentient beings. So if you say they have a particular shape, which means they have a shape that requires the actions of someone who made it, that reason is not established. That's why you will not have a property of the subject. Yeah?
딱은 이거지. 딱 말했어. 이 미쳐버다 되게 실수가야지. 기부 소리기 저수 중에 기부 소리 저수 제대로 아니 입시도 와서 대단히 호랑이 입이 뭐 아니 집어래 와서 입 믿어 개발요 집어래 와서 대성식 입이 개발 때 와서 거기 대성식이 나와서.
So is that okay? So when they said particular shape, if particular means particular in the sense that it's made by somebody, then that's the first analysis. There will be no property of the subject. The reason is not valid. If the second one, which says, if it merely means having shape, if by particular shape you're only referring to having shape, it's there in the commentary above. Is the meaning of having particular shape that it is a shape that necessarily requires the actions of someone who made it, or is the reason merely having shape, right? So these are the two things that are being checked. Now we're going on to the second one, which is merely having shape, right? So if you say it has to be preceded by the mind of somebody because it has shape, right? Just the fact that it has shape is sufficient to prove that it's preceded by the mind of somebody. As in, this cup has a shape, the external world has a shape. The fact that it has shape is the meaning of particular shape. If that's what you refer to, then there's a second analysis that's done.
뭐 네가 아니 기부 소리 저수 너네 이 개발 와야 되니 자본 대나 아니 이 개발이 여기 찍어내고 와서 딱이 고와 대성시나 아들 개발이 이기 이주도 제가 오면 저기 제가 이 개발을
So if you're saying that the abodes and beings have a shape, and in as much as them having shape is common with this pot that has a shape that is made by someone. This has a shape that's made by someone, and it has a shape. If you're only taking the aspect of it having a shape as a common feature with abodes and beings, then there's no pervasion. You will not be able to prove that merely because it has shape, it has to be preceded by the mind of a creator.
리디 강가 메두스 윤세 가르치려나 아니 단다 깨우세지 도와나시 카도 요리게 도와단자를 도와만 힘바로 도와단자를 카도 찍고 요리게 요와 어디기 파게라니 매요 윤세 가르치려나 깨우서 왔어 어디기 깨우제디 아니 도와다 매리게디 도와다 아니 카도 찍고 래 다 되게 거버시 차
So how there will be no pervasion is when it's like, for instance, trying to prove that on that hill there is fire because there is a whitish substance. For example, when you see smoke on the fire, you see something that has like a white color, right? It has a whitish color. If it's enough to have one element in common between two things to prove that there is another one, then you can prove that smoke has a whitish color. And wherever you see now something with a whitish color, the same way that you can infer fire through smoke, by the presence of a whitish color which is common in smoke, you should also be able to infer fire. So if, because it has a shape in common, just the fact that there is shape in common, where in one case it is shape created by someone, and in the other case it's just shape, if that's enough to prove that it was created by Ishvara, then by proving a whitish substance, which is also there in smoke, should be sufficient to prove that there is fire on a hill. However, you can't prove that pervasion. Therefore, if you're giving the second meaning of merely having shape as evidence, it's not going to be a correct sign because there's no pervasion.
제법의 기부를 조회 제수 아니 조대행이 분배기 입대당 자본기 입대당 그니 입이고 기부를 봐 입이고 나와를 봐 다디 전화 가르쳐버려 아니 겨우 요대행이 거기 지리가 매여대 매리게 도와대다 겨우니부디 카도 지고래 다디 참 나디 참.
So this is how the contradiction would be. This mountain behind us, this Dharamshala mountain, take this mountain, this becomes your subject, yeah? It follows it is preceded by the actions of someone, yeah? Because it being a shape is similar, it having the quality of shape, this much is similar with the fact that this cup that has the shape made by somebody are the same, yeah? So this cup has a shape that's made by somebody. This hill has a shape. In as much as both of them have a shape, that much is common. So the reason that the thinking behind their process would be take this hill, it follows it is preceded by the actions of someone, because like the pot that has a shape that is made by somebody, in as much as it has shape, this much is common. That's the reason. That would become the reason. Okay? This would then therefore also be valid by saying, take that hill, it follows there is fire, because just as smoke is a whitish substance, there is a whitish substance and just this much is in common. Yeah? So then both of these should be reasons that equally prove pervasions if your thinking is accurate. That's how the reason works. And so the explanation here is, well created as distinct entities, but not being distinct by way of similar verbal expression is not correct inference. Like, for example, fire from a whitish substance.
대담이는 자기이 공부하고 지금 이동규 것이 제일 좋아하는 제가 제일 두르세데 나무상이 이 사람을 파악하는 거 있으나 도가슬라베는 먼저 무좀의 큰 것이 두고 무좀의 하나 한번 상수고 이러면서 도가스기에 소나 되게 도가디 아니 자본 수익이 강사되게 아니 수려버려요. 이제 가르치려나 아니 자본 수익이 강사되기 수입이 자본 대기 입대나 도가기 입이고도 입이 나와 이 경우 파악이 그렇게
So then, Acharya Dharmakirti then says, okay, now not only is there something wrong with what you're saying, let me give you a absurdity that will arise from the way you're thinking about it. And that is, if that were not so, then just as a potter fashions things such as pots made of clay, even a termite nest would have to be made by him. So Acharya Dharmakirti says, take a termite nest, things they have that shape, no? Take a termite nest, it follows it's made by a potter, because a potter has made a clay pot that has a shape, and inasmuch as it has a shape, this much is also common with a termite nest. What are you going to tell me over here? The fact that you can refer to both of them as having shape is common with a pot that has been made by a potter and a termite nest. Both of them have shape. If just this much were enough to prove that there is pervasion, then take a termite nest, it follows it's made by a potter, because the fact that it has shape is shared in common also with a clay pot that has been made by the potter. Yeah? So how will you respond to this? So that's what this is. If that were not so, then just as a potter fashions things such as pots made of clay, even a termite nest would have to be made by him. So up until here, what we've seen so far is whatever reasons that they are giving to prove that Ishvara is the creator of the world, with these three reasons, having checked the three reasons by asking them what they mean when they say the various parts of the syllogism that they're giving, and having checked whether these can be accurate meanings, or whether when they describe them in this way, it can be a correct sign, or it can be the three modes or not, Acharya Dharmakirti shows why the reasoning that they're providing for proving a creator doesn't hold up, why it's inconsistent. So, how one we can proceed in understanding this when you debate now? First, debate or try and understand well when you will debate. Try and bring out what the opponent's view is. So get a clear idea of what they're saying. And then get a clear idea of the reasons that they're giving to support their thesis. Right? Their thesis is that the mind of Ishvara is the creator of everything. They're giving reasons to support what they're saying. So first, when you debate, open your debates by getting or asking each other, what is the opponent's position, what exactly do they say, and how do they support it with the reasons that they're giving. Okay? And then, once you've understood this, then the next step is list out the various objections that Acharya Dharmakirti is giving to them, and see how these objections actually are kind of contradicting or refuting their position. So first get a good idea of what their position is and the reasoning that they have to support it. Then get a good idea of what the reasons that Acharya Dharmakirti gives are, and how each one of these reasons is addressing one or more aspects of their position. Yeah? When you've done this enough, so you're not just debating it straight away, you're setting that stage like we said, where you're getting a good idea of what they're saying, why they're saying it, and how Acharya Dharmakirti is seeing errors in their presentation, and how he's addressing them with his own reasoning. Once this is clear, and you've debated this enough, then you can actually take the same reasoning and apply it to the Buddhist position, which is take the world and take beings and abodes. It follows they're preceded by karma. And what reason can you ask the Buddhists to suggest or provide that this has to be preceded by karma, right? Because if we're asking them to give reasons and we're refuting them, and their reasons are not holding up, we should also be able to give a reason that supports our position. So first, understand their position, their reasons, try and understand and have a clear idea of how Acharya Dharmakirti's refutation is addressing their concerns or their points, and then try and see what could be the reasons that the Buddhists give for why abodes and beings have to be preceded by karma. What is the reasoning for that? Yeah, that comes later. Okay. So for example, if you were now to think about it, the fact that we're all sitting in this room, the way you think of, the way one can check it or analyze it is, if you're sitting in this room, if all of us are here, there's going to be only 3 real explanations that you can narrow out. The first one is like the view over here, which is we are here because someone else has willed us to be here. So us having been here, being together, sitting here, doing what we're doing, has been willed by someone else. That's one. So the mind of a creator precedes it, right? The will of someone. The other alternative is the way the Buddhists say that we're all here doing what we're doing because there's certain things that we have all done in our past that are now ripening, and therefore the results are ripening of various actions that we've all accumulated, which are leading us to be here. That's the second alternative. Or the third alternative, like the Charvaka alternative, is there is no previous life, there is no such thing as past actions. Us being here is kind of random. It has just come about as a one-off kind of thing, and there is nothing really that leads us to be here. It's a random occurrence. Yeah, it's like almost like chaos theory. It's a random occurrence that's just happened. Okay, so it's going to have to be one of these 3. So up until here, we finished one section. Yeah. The next section is the Charvakas and their kind of their refutation of the Buddhist idea. And the Charvakas here say, okay, fine, so you've refuted and you've given lots of reasons to say why the meaning of infallible being cannot be someone that created everything and knows everything. But then what do you mean by infallible being? If your understanding of infallible being is someone that knows all hidden things, like it says here, the reason why we're talking about hidden things is because things that are obvious, manifest things, we also know. We don't need to rely on someone to explain what hidden things are, right? So if you mean, so the Charvaka is saying to the Buddhists, if by infallible being you Buddhists mean someone that knows all hidden things, if that's your understanding of infallible being, but not the creator of everything, then you also will not be able to hold up your position that the meaning of infallible being is someone that knows all hidden things, because you have no great reasons to support or explain why someone can be infallible.
심부 장다 타르고 유탐지시 기분 매기 쳤어. 그러나 먼저 도다지 표상력이 고려 나와 뒤나로라 뭐 가지고 있으라고이나 이 탐지시 중에 가서 수요 요거. 다만은 이게 말한 저기 왕국이 주면에 왔다 타르고 슈들이 요로가 장민소 유니버스라고 이제 민체시와 아주 깨지셔야 되다. 모두 간략하게 요리해서 나와요. 타르고 제 탐지 시중에 수요. 요거. 내가 이제 캐나다 세미기부스에 탐지기 되시하고 계시셔야 되지 가르치라.
So, like they say over here, a Charvaka might say, just as there is no infallible being that created and knows all, there can also be no infallible being that knows all hidden things. Because there is no one that knows how many insects exist, nor all things that are extremely distant. So, for example, within Thosamling, if someone wants to say how many insects are there, no one really knows the answer to that. So if you can't say how many insects are there in Thosamling, nor can you see things that are beyond your sensory abilities, like the details of distant planets and distant worlds. If you can't say what's there, and you can't tell the number of insects over here, then you can't really know all hidden things. And if you can't know all hidden things, then you Buddhists who go on talking about this infallible being, someone who knows all hidden phenomena, you will not be able to prove that such a being exists, because there is no one who can tell you exactly how many insects exist over here, nor is there anyone who can tell you all the details of things that are at a far distance where their abilities cannot reach. So as a response, first Acharya Dharmakirti identifies what he means or what is meant when they talk about an infallible being. That's the first step.
뉴주 zambuling di sura shebena ta dinam le de ge simjen sama dewa de ko ni me de sha ba ani sama ge dewi yu du go la dewa de 다시 je de du ne se ge 다시 je du de ina ya ji ge du ne den se wa ji ga dewa den to wa ji ma zu su ji ga ya ji chung du mi du wa sa tong bi du la no me to so da ta ye ga se go sa ba na 만수 내 대화되고 누에되고 말해 이게 매일이 아니 예리 규타도 가리네 눈이 규타도 가리네 아니 예리 규대 아니 안에서 그룹을 눈이 규타도 같아 공식이 있고 가리요래 이 일이 마저 코와 나무는 눈이 코랑이 코와는 주비 규 안에서 고리요래 아니 코와는 뭐게 마음 가리네 이게 코와 주도기 남 신지 말로가 아니 여기 내가 이 재미있게 보시게 하고 시류비 장마리고 개만해서야라고 하루 통마 통이 되게 무시 연에서 데려다가 재미있게 보시게 되는데 아빠도 줄어들었어요.
So in response to this I guess opposition, Acharya Dharmakirti, when he clarifies what we mean by or what he means by an infallible being, he says, when I talk of infallible being, I'm not referring to someone who can tell you how many insects are there or who can see things that are at large distances. When I talk about an infallible being, what I mean is, since all sentient beings are equal in wishing to be happy and not suffer, but we see that the things that we do don't lead us to a stable, lasting form of happiness, and what we do actually somehow, sometimes perpetuates suffering. When I talk of an infallible being, what I mean is someone who can help us understand what actions will lead to actual happiness and what actions will lead to a removal of suffering. So someone who has complete understanding of the means to get out of suffering or out of samsara and the means to attain a stable, unchanging state of happiness or nirvana. Someone who has understood this, who has attained this, and who can explain this perfectly to us, that's my understanding, or that's what I identify as an infallible being. Whether they know how many insects are there, or they can see things in a distance is not relevant. What I mean by infallible is someone who has meets this criteria and can actually show you what needs to be developed to attain happiness and what needs to be discarded to remove suffering. That's my meaning of infallible being.
이 아리사와가 쇼로가 지구디 랑도 더제 디미네 타바 제바 릭제와 강제 세만 이득이 강제 릭제와 이노.
And so this verse encapsulates this idea that Acharya Dharmakirti is putting forward, which is one who knows the realities of what is to be developed and discarded, along with the methods, is asserted to be infallible. One who knows all things is not.
오늘가 랑자스디 냥게 도자스디 코와 이지리 아니 코와의 냥게스 계지체 아니 탑도 제바스디 아니 코와를 주비 딱코 코난게지마 코와를 녹게지마 이 코로는 주도 탑도 제바 무슨 통되게 무슨 유리되게 데레데라 예치미지스기요 이게 강사사랑 예치미지스기요 아니 탐지 무슨 통되게 리지 보였을라는데 통되게 되는 게 있으면
And so what over here, I'm not sure developed is the right word, I'll just put a question mark, I'll check. But basically what is to be developed here is what is to be attained, which is nirvana. What is to be discarded is suffering, samsara. Along with the methods means the means or the tools, the methods required to attain nirvana and the methods required to overcome samsara. Yeah? So someone who knows this directly is what I call an infallible being. This is the meaning of infallible. Just someone who knows all phenomena directly is not what I mean when I talk about an infallible being. So one who knows the realities of what is to be developed, it says, right? So why is this an infallible being? Because someone who knows what I want, what I need, what I'm wishing for, if someone knows that directly, has experienced that, has attained that, and they know the reality of that, they know how that is, then that's the person who I can rely on. That's why I call an infallible being someone who knows the reality, who has experienced, who has attained what I wished for. So then it carries on. Whether they can see far or not is irrelevant as long as one sees the reality of what is desired. So if they can see the reality of what we desire, that's enough. Whether they can see far away or not is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. What do you call a heart doctor? Cardiologist.
So design kaga yoba yindi kesi ning nebachi yimba ta ning neba yimbachi ta khobi deba kai ma ning na sa chago ning na sa gangi sewo so ta khola tsimi ki bu khari chho ta ko doctor khandi chi ten go la ba ina ning na so ko le shin yi ji ten go ma do ning na so ko le gyu mebachi rugo ge ani amji ji ten ga cheba ina如果 암지 가슴하고 가슴 캐바 이해가 있나냐? 크기 시에샤바도 크기 호랑이 로종다 호랑이 캐바가리 여대더디 니 되고 주변에 가야 편도요. 소가 됐다. 소서 루고기 암지디 루고고라 가지기 캐바 연한다 내난다 이 니기 되바 니기 나서 세바라 편도 가는 거. 소서 딱 말을 가르치고 말을 가르치고는 니기 나서 보는 뜻이 참
So, if you want to get an example of what this infallible being means, or someone who is completely reliable, if you take it down a notch and you try and understand it through an example, If you are sick and your condition is a heart condition, when you will then try and look for someone who can help you out, you have this medical profession which is divided in so many specializations. So you have cardiologist, osteopath, gastroenterologist, you have this whole list of people. If your condition is a heart condition, then what you want is someone who can cure you of your heart condition. If you then seek advice or help from someone, the person who you can rely on or who is infallible with respect to what you need is going to be someone who knows that. So it's going to be a cardiologist. If you go to an osteopath, they might be extremely well versed in their field of medicine and they might know all the details about the bones and how to do all of that. But even though they might be experts and not just experts, but like pioneers in their field with complete knowledge of what they know, if your condition or your ailment has nothing to do with the information that they know, it's of no benefit to you. So over here it's the same. This is an example. If your condition is a heart condition, you have to find someone who is well versed, an expert in, has experience, and is completely all-rounded in the thing that you desire most, which is your heart, which is that which needs to be fixed. If you rely on any other field, irrespective of how much of an expert they might be, that's not going to be of any benefit. So for you, as a heart patient, who becomes infallible is someone who is like an excellent, complete cardiologist. That's an example. So like the example, now when you think of the example in terms of what the text is saying over here, it says, in the same way, if you are someone who wishes to be happy and someone who wishes to remove suffering, if that's your aim, then what you need to find is someone who knows what the causes of happiness are, can identify them well, can explain to you the path that leads to being happy, someone who's identified the causes of suffering, someone who can tell you how to overcome these causes of suffering, and someone who's well versed in this. If this is your aim, then this is the kind of person you need to seek out. If you go and start talking to an astronomer or someone who can tell you whether there is water on Mars or what the details of various planets are, it's of no benefit. So there's no need really to be impressed by someone who has that kind of extensive knowledge in other fields if they don't have the knowledge of what you need, which is, this is the cause for happiness, this is the cause for suffering, this is how you overcome this cause, this is how you attain the other cause, this is how you attain the result that you wish for. So, assuming someone has clairvoyant states or has these kind of superpowers and they can actually through clairvoyance tell you, oh, there's so many insects, oh, this is what's happening in that distant land. Even if they have these qualities, if that doesn't respond to your requirement, which is how do I attain a stable state of happiness and overcome suffering, with all of these excellent qualities that they might have, what benefit is it to you? It's not significant. So if that's your search, if your search for an infallible being comes from the need to understand how to be happy and overcome suffering, then the criteria for infallibility are different from someone who just might be clairvoyant or have all of these powers. What you need is someone who is infallible with respect to how to attain happiness and remove suffering. That's all that matters. That's how you use the example of the doctor over here.
디나시 파고 통도에 누가 먼저 밀면 이제 계속 콜라에 이겨요. 그러니까 콜라가 아마 되는 게 해봐도
So if once you found someone who can give you this is complete in their ability to show you how to get out of samsara or out of suffering and attain a state of stable, long-lasting happiness, which is nirvana. And this you've met, or this is your search and you found this, but you're not satisfied and you want more and you are really impressed by these kind of abilities or these clairvoyances, these states of siddhis or these samadhis that one might attain, like, oh no, it's quite amazing or it's quite inspiring that someone can see far in the distance and they have these kind of superpowers. Then Acharya Dharmakirti says, well then that's fine. If that's what you want, then come devote yourself to vultures, because vultures can also see things that are at large distances. So if that's what impresses you and that's what you want, then sure, why don't you rely on vultures as your gurus as well? So that's what this means when it says, if seeing far makes for being infallible, come, devote yourselves to vultures. So then the next verse, which is, how do you search for an infallible being? For instance, if you set out to look for somebody, you're going to have to look for some quality that's going to help you identify them. So here, how to search for an infallible being is talking about someone who is searching for one, and if we are someone who's searching for an infallible being, then when we set out and we look for someone who's infallible or not, we need to find somebody who has a certain quality. And the quality that we need to find in the person that makes them infallible or not should be someone who is well versed and capable in guiding us out of suffering and into a state of reliable, stable happiness, right? If they have this quality, then you can say, okay, well then that's a quality that qualifies them to be an infallible being. Everything else is of no benefit or is no use to me. So that's the verse that says, therefore, so this is like a kind of guideline for how to seek out an infallible being. It says, therefore seek out whether they have the wisdom of what can be accomplished. Knowing the number of insects is of no use whatsoever for me. So when you start looking for this infallible being, if it's clear what you want and you're looking for someone who can give you what you want, everything else is insignificant, it's secondary. If they have it or not does not become a necessary condition for you identifying them as someone who you can rely on or someone who is infallible with respect to what you need. And so that's what it says when it says knowing the number of insects is of no use whatsoever. So whether they have these other qualities or not, that's of no concern to me. It doesn't matter to me. So what this is also giving in very directly is also advice to us, in the sense that if you know what you want, like, so now one has to kind of go and start looking for someone. We look for these gurus or people to rely on. And when we look for people to rely on, or we look for people to then follow, if our drive is to understand that we need to find a way to eliminate our suffering, and we need to find a way to be happy or develop a state of stable, lasting happiness, if that's what we're looking for, then this gives a very clear guideline of what you're looking for in your guru or whoever it is that you want to rely on. If this is not met, and you get interested or swayed by all sorts of other qualities or very impressed by other qualities, and this gets sidetracked or this gets kind of left to the side, and there are other reasons that we suddenly start considering as justification for why someone is infallible, someone we should rely on, or someone is going to work out for us in the long run, if we haven't identified what we want and whether the person can give it to us, and there's a whole other set of criteria that suddenly starts taking precedence and impressing us, then even if they have those qualities, actually it's of no benefit to us, because that's not going to give us what we're actually looking for. So in that sense, these two verses are also a very good guideline for us when we set out and we start looking for someone who we want to follow or listen to, or someone whose advice we seek out and whose counsel we try and implement. So what this means as a result is, if you are in the presence of various lamas, initially you listen to what they have to say, and when you hear what they have to say, you check and you analyze whether what they are saying can satisfy what you want. So first you have a clear idea of what it is you want, and then you see whether the teachings or the message that is being conveyed to you from these various lamas is something that you want. And if you get what you're seeking is something that you get, then that's something little more stable to rely on. Whereas the general predominant tendency is, without really checking, because we are not really understanding what we want and not really checking whether we're getting what we want, the way we end up following people seems to be people who have a larger number of followings, who are more famous, more well known. They end up getting highest demand. So reputation seems to precede or become the main drive for why we then seek out someone. That's the predominant tendency. So this way of relying on someone is kind of like, I recently had to go to Bombay for some work, and when I was in Bombay I had to find a hotel, but I didn't really know anything about the hotels. So when I had to figure out which one was a good one, I had to find some way to judge, and when I asked a friend of mine, they said, you have to look at the reviews. And so when I was looking at the reviews, there were some that had really low reviews and some that had really good reviews. And so then I booked one that had a really good review. But the weird thing was, when I actually landed up over there, there was this one building half of which was a really good one and the other half was not a really good one. And so just because it had gotten a good review doesn't turn out it was a good review, and so then just because something has good reviews, it doesn't pan out when you're actually going to learn. That was like an anecdote.